I'm speaking with Dr. Carl Schalk, Distinguished Professor of Music Emeritus at Concordia University, Chicago at River Forest, Illinois. Dr. Schalk, can you tell me about your relationship with our former conductor, Victor Hildner?
Well, I first met Victor Hildner when I was a sophomore in high school. He came in my sophomore year to direct the choir, the first full-time choir director we had at Concordia Teachers College High School at what is now Concordia University, Chicago. He was an extremely energetic and interesting conductor, and I sang with him all through the years in high school. And then for the next 5 years in college, after he began to be director of the choir in the college department. So I was with him for essentially 9 years at Concordia, and it was an exciting time. It was the time when, immediately after World War II, there was a lot of musicological activity. A lot of the projects which had been abandoned or stopped during World War II were now beginning to be resumed, and a lot of the treasures of older music was beginning to be made available. And as that occurred, we were part of that process as we sang it, as Victor Hildner began to become more and more aware of it, and as then we, as singers in his choirs, began to sing that music, and it began to be part of our experience. It was a very exciting time. And then after a hiatus of about 13 years, I came back to Concordia to teach in the music department. And at that time, or shortly thereafter, Victor Hildner became director of the Oak Park Concert Chorale, and he was very kind enough to invite me, then also Paul Lindblad, the later director, to write several pieces for the organization, and I was pleased to do so, and they have premiered any number of my pieces in the past.
One of the pieces that we have done recently is the Lamentations of Isaiah and the Lamentations of Jeremiah and the prophecies of Isaiah. Can you tell me a little bit about the genesis of these pieces?
Well, the 4 choruses from the Lamentations of Jeremiah were part of a larger project that I was involved in graduate school, which involved becoming acquainted with particularly American composers. And part of the final project was to give a class presentation on the composer we had chosen, and then as part of that to write a piece or pieces in the style in which that composer wrote. And so the 4 choruses from the Lamentations of Jeremiah had that kind of genesis. They were written around 1954 to 55 and were then performed in a number of places, and soon were being performed by high school choirs around the country as they were published. The choruses from the Lamentations of Jeremiah were my first published composition by Concordia Publishing House, and they were soon picked up and sung by high school choirs in their state contests and so on, and they were really quite well known and continue to be so up to this day. They're short, and they're pithy. All 4 choruses together last maybe 3-4 minutes, and but they are within the ability of high school choirs, and that was their intent. And I was pleased with how they worked. Then if you fast forward about 50 years later, Victor Hildner asked me if I would compose something similar to that. And so I settled on 4 choruses from the book of Isaiah. And so while the first 4 choruses from Jeremiah were filled with a lot of gloom and doom and woe and lamentation, the 4 choruses from Jeremiah were the prophecies and filled with hope and looking to the future. And so those were then written and premiered then by the Oak Park Concert Chorale not too many years ago. And they have also since been published. Although they are, in the sense, bookends, They are quite different in style. The Lamentations choruses being quite astringent, quite lean and bare and spare. The choruses from Isaiah are richer harmonically. They employ, two of them employ double choir and are just a little richer and in their harmonic design. But they nevertheless, in my mind, are two bookends, the Lamentations and the prophecies of Isaiah. And they were both have been involved with the Oak Park Concert Chorale over the years.
You also wrote a collection of pieces called the Biblical Scenes, which is on our CD. Can you tell me something about these?
Well, the biblical scenes are stories from the New Testament. The actual selection of scriptural texts are taken from the appointed lessons for the Sundays, particularly from the appointed Gospels. And they involve two parts. First is the actual text of the Gospel reading, or some portion of it. For example, in the reading for Palm Sunday, where the crowd sings the phrase, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," that part was set for chorus, to be interrupting the reading of the lesson, so that as the lesson is being read, when you come to that point, the choir jumps in and sings that just as if it were part of the reading. That's the first part. The second part of each group of motets is a motet based on a new text by Jill Baumgartner, in which he takes the subject matter of that gospel motet and fashions a new poetic form about that story. And then that is set as a separate motet. So there are pairs of motets. The first part being the portion of the gospel lesson, which is set for choir. The second portion is then the contemporary poem, which is then also set for chorus. And the idea of these scenes is that, at least in the liturgical churches, that the first motet would be sung in the course of the gospel reading. And then the second part, which is the meditative contemplation on that story by Jill Baumgartner, that would take place most likely during Holy Communion or at some other appropriate time in the service, when one could have a moment of quiet meditation on the significance and meaning of that text as it is explained in that poem.
Now, we have also performed several motets by Richard Hillert, the motet for the time of Easter and the motet for Pentecost, as well as the Agnus Dei by Richard Hillert. Can you speak a little bit about who was Richard Hillert and how were you connected with him?
Richard Hillert and I go back to our college days when we were both in the same class, which entered Concordia Teachers College, now Concordia University, Chicago. In our freshman year, we became acquainted with each other and were then good friends ever since. In various strange ways, our paths, our career paths, have in a sense paralleled each other in many ways. First of all, our years at college, when he was a budding composer of some significance, and I was part of a number of the many performances of his works, which were done here at Concordia when he was a college student. He graduated, I graduated, we both went out into congregations where we were teachers in the parochial school. He went to St. Louis, Missouri, I went to Wausau, Wisconsin, and in my second year of being in Wausau, he came also to Wausau, where we were in neighboring schools, one on each side of the river. I was just newly married. He was not yet married at the time. So he spent many hours at our home and talking about the great issues of the world and talking about music and his role and what he was doing. He wrote many pieces for us at my church, which we performed. And then he took a call to Concordia Teachers College, where he was a professor in the music department. My career took me to St. Louis for 7 years, and in 1965 I was called to Concordia Teachers College, now Concordia University, Chicago, and we became colleagues in the music department once again, where we both served until we both retired, and we continued to be friends and to do things musically together and to talk music and so on. The pieces which were recorded by the Oak Park Concert Chorale were pieces which evolved from Richard Hillert's years in his doctoral study at Northwestern University. And as part of that, he was exploring all the various new devices and musical forms and means with which to express himself. And the choral music then, in these pieces, you find particularly sections of aleatoric music, chants music. There is some 12-tone examples of 12-tone music in there, are sections of that. And so these larger pieces, and these were our larger scale pieces, most of them for multi-choirs, in which he was exploring to see how that would work itself out in larger, in this case, choral music. All of them were commissioned by Thomas Gieschen, who was the director of the choir at the Concordia College at that time, and were performed in public concerts throughout those years. They are significant musical pieces, but they do represent that experimental period in his life. I would just say this too about Richard Hillert. He is one of the most, and has been one of the most significant Lutheran composers of the latter half of the 20th century and into the beginning of the 21st century. He has made significant contributions to the liturgical music of the Lutheran Church, as well as choral and organ music, instrumental music, and a wide variety of kinds of music with which he was involved really throughout his life. And I'm happy to say that his collected works will be residing at the Center for Church Music at Concordia University, and they are being in the process now of being transferred gradually over to their care, where they will be a resource for further study and performance by those who may want to use them.
During your tenure at Concordia University, which was, I understand, 29 years, what would you say were the main accomplishments that you did that you were most proud of?
Well, some were in the academic realm and some were in the extracurricular realm. I was always directing choirs. I directed the college chorus, which at that time was a large group of about 100, which performed several concerts a year with orchestra. And in that group, the years when I conducted them, we did a lot of the larger scale works, many of them which had not been heard before on the campus. But the one thing that I did do completely throughout my tenure was I directed the chapel choir, which was a smaller choir which sang for the chapel services several times a week, and which dealt really with the kind of literature that most people would be dealing with when they go out and direct their volunteer choirs in various parishes. And that was kind of where I centered my attention and the thing that I loved to do most. And of course, it waxed and waned as a student and would sing in the choir. Sometimes you'd have a larger group, sometimes you'd have a smaller group. You'd have to be very facile in adapting yourself to the singers, the use of instruments, and so on and so forth. But that was really kind of where I found the greatest pleasure in doing that. The other things that I did while I was in my teaching career was to edit Church Music magazine, which was published from 1966 until 1980, which was a significant part of the musical scene at that time. And that, together with inaugurating the annual Lectures in Church Music, which continues on to this day, where lots of interest has centered around those activities, and it's satisfying to know that they are still going today and that they are still filling a real need for church musicians who come back annually and filling a need in their professional preparation for work in the church.
Now you and Richard Hillert both have a particular interest in liturgical music, and much of your work has had to do with either composing music for the liturgy or of studying liturgical music. What caused that interest, inspired that interest in you?
Well, I think we both, in a sense, came of age at a time when Lutherans were remembering their significant heritage of liturgy and church music. In that post-Second World War period, there was a tremendous emphasis upon that. And so the role of the choir, for example, and the role of the organ in the liturgy is crucial. And so one begins with the liturgy and works out. Where does the liturgy call for choral music, or where is it possible to use choral music in the liturgy? That is the order in which one proceeds, I think, as a Lutheran composer. Not, here is a piece I wrote, where can I stuff it into the liturgy somewhere? That's just the opposite of what we need to be doing. And I think Richard and I both had that point of view. And so we tended to do and to write and compose music for the liturgy. Now, that's a rich treasury of possibilities there, because it can involve the congregation, the choir. It can involve instruments of a variety of kinds, certainly the organ, and the possibilities are tremendous. And that's what you will see. At least much of my music is directed toward those ends, as is a good deal of his. Richard did do a larger number of large concert works, which have also been premiered at Concordia University and throughout the country. But I think the focus on liturgical music is really where we both came to realize is the real genius of certainly music in the Lutheran tradition, as well as other liturgical churches. And that was the reason for our interest in that.
Now, both you and Dr. Hillert had a big influence on me. And I think one of the connections is with Victor Hildner. And many of the things that I did with Victor Hildner, I think that you also ended up doing when you were a student. I was invited to participate in his church choir. I was given conducting lessons and mentored by him. And I understand that you also sang for 7 years under him while you were in high school and college. Is that correct?
7 or 8, depending on how you count them. Yes, and I was his student assistant for many of those years, and so I had many similar experiences to that. And we all learn from our mentors. We learn what to do, how to do things, and sometimes we learn how not to do things and things to avoid as we grow in our understanding of what we're all about. And that was true of my experience with him. But he was a tremendous influence not only on me, but on many people who sang with him, who were his students, and then who went out into parishes and congregations to be directors of music or to teach music in the schools, which was also an important part of the training at that time. And so he was a tremendous influence, no question.
Well, I'm very grateful that you have composed so many pieces for us and that you have taken the time for this interview. I thank you very much.
You're welcome.